Background and early life of Billie-Jo Jenkins and the Jenkins family. Billie-Jo Jenkins was born on March 29, 1983, in East London, into circumstances that were challenging from the very start. Her father went to prison when she was still a young child, and her mother, struggling to manage life alone, placed her children into foster care. At the age of 9, Billie-Jo entered the foster system, a move that would profoundly shape her sense of identity, security, and belonging. Life in foster care, while providing safety, could not erase the feelings of displacement and vulnerability that often accompany children separated from their biological parents. In 1992, Billie-Jo and her brother Daryl were welcomed into the Jenkins household by Sion and Lois Jenkins, who responded to an advertisement seeking foster parents. While Daryl soon left the household, Billie-Jo remained and became integrated into the family. The Jenkinses provided her with a semblance of permanence, something she had lacked during the earlier years of her childhood. The family eventually relocated to Hastings in 1993, where Sion began teaching at William Parker's School for Boys. Over time, the Jenkins household offered Billie-Jo not just care but structure and support. Her new environment provided the stability she needed to thrive academically and socially, helping her navigate the challenges of adolescence. Billie-Jo, by all accounts, adapted well to her new circumstances. Neighbors described her as polite, well-mannered, and intelligent, a girl with bright prospects and a personality that blended warmth, creativity, and resilience. While her earlier experiences had been marked by uncertainty, her time with the Jenkins family allowed her to grow into a spirited, confident young teenager. She developed hobbies and interests, including artistic pursuits, which became both a source of personal satisfaction and a reflection of her imaginative mind. Her foster family encouraged her creativity, and she spent hours engaged in painting, music, and other expressive activities. By February 1997, Billie-Jo was 13 years old and navigating life as an adolescent, balancing her responsibilities at home with school commitments. The day of her murder, February 15th, coincided with the end of the school half-term break, a period when many children in the neighborhood were outside enjoying the unseasonably warm weather. For Billie-Jo, the afternoon began innocuously. She had argued with her foster mother, Lois, over a pair of trainers she wanted but could not have. Lois, seeking to redirect her energy, suggested that Billie-Jo spend some time in the garden painting the patio doors, a task that blended creativity with productive distraction. The Jenkins household, located on Lower Park Road, was a seemingly safe, quiet street in Hastings, bordered by Alexandra Park across the road. On that Saturday, the sun shone warmly, and families filled the park with laughter, conversation, and the sounds of children at play. Billie-Jo remained in the garden, focused on her painting project, while her foster sister Annie stayed inside. Lois took other children, including Ma and Esther, for a walk with the dog, leaving Billie-Jo under the impression she would be safely attended to and unbothered during the afternoon. The family rhythm appeared ordinary, and the garden offered an environment of normalcy and calm. The Jenkins family dynamic was complex. Sion Jenkins, a teacher who had risen to the position of deputy head at William Parker School for Boys, presented himself as a successful and competent figure within the community. Lois Jenkins, his partner and later wife, balanced her role as caregiver and mother with maintaining household order. Within this environment, Billie-Jo developed relationships that combined affection, guidance, and expectation. Yet, even in a stable household, tensions occasionally surfaced. Arguments over possessions, discipline, and behavior were not uncommon, reflecting both the ordinary challenges of adolescence and the pressures inherent in a household managing multiple children, foster responsibilities, and public-facing professional roles. Billie-Jo's life, however, was not devoid of anxiety or prior warning signs. She had expressed concerns about being followed or watched, first in 1995 and again leading up to February 1997. Anonymous phone calls, eerie sightings of men loitering near her home or in the nearby park, and encounters with strangers contributed to a sense of vulnerability. Her foster parents, aware of these incidents, had installed security measures, including window locks and lights, to safeguard the children. The proximity of the Jenkins home to an abandoned, boarded-up property heightened fears, as the potential for someone to hide and watch remained a real concern. Billie-Jo, perceptive and cautious despite her young age, had voiced these worries to friends, family, and school authorities. These early fears underscored both her awareness of personal safety and the fragility of her environment. The Jenkins household, while offering structure and care, also had complexities in familial relationships. Discipline, parenting style, and household authority created a nuanced dynamic that would later become scrutinized during the investigation and trial. Instances of corporal discipline, occasional arguments between children and foster parents, and the stress of managing multiple responsibilities created an environment that, while generally stable, had elements of tension and conflict. Observers would later debate the impact of these household dynamics on the tragic events of February 15, 1997, but it was clear that Billie-Jo's upbringing involved both protection and exposure to complex familial pressures. Academically and socially, Billie-Jo thrived. Her neighbors recalled a young girl who was polite, intelligent, and engaged with her community. Friends described her as bright, cheerful, and well-mannered, embodying qualities that reflected both her early experiences in foster care and the supportive environment of the Jenkins household. She was creative, often spending hours painting, and attentive to her responsibilities, including schoolwork and household tasks. These characteristics, however, also highlighted the enormity of the loss when the crime occurred, as she was seen as a promising young adolescent whose potential was abruptly and violently curtailed. By the afternoon of February 15th, Billie-Jo's ordinary life intersected with extraordinary danger. Within an hour of completing minor household tasks and engaging in her painting project, she would be subjected to a violent attack that ended her life. The background of her life, marked by early childhood hardship, integration into a foster family, development of creativity and intelligence, and a strong, observant awareness of her surroundings, sets the stage for understanding both the tragedy itself and the broader narrative of her existence. It is within this context of growth, resilience, and prior vulnerability that the events of that February afternoon unfolded, transforming a bright young life into a central focus of one of Britain's most perplexing and debated criminal investigations. Understanding Billie-Jo Jenkins' background also requires consideration of the broader Hastings community. A coastal town with historical charm, Hastings had long been regarded as safe, family-friendly, and welcoming to newcomers. Its parks, shops, and streets fostered a sense of familiarity and security, making the attack on Billie-Jo all the more shocking. Her placement in a seemingly ordinary suburban environment, combined with the ordinary activities of a quiet Saturday afternoon, underscores the profound rupture of normalcy caused by the crime. The day of the murder and initial investigation, Saturday, February 15, 1997, began as a bright and unseasonably warm afternoon in Hastings, a seaside town on the Sussex coast. The streets were lively for mid-February, with families filling Alexandra Park across from the Jenkins family home on Lower Park Road. Birds chirp, children's laughter echoed across the grass, and the sun lent a golden warmth to the otherwise cool winter air. Within the Jenkins household, however, an ordinary afternoon was unfolding, a scene of calm and routine that would soon be shattered by one of the most shocking crimes in Britain's history. Billie-Jo Jenkins, a 13-year-old foster daughter, was in the garden, paintbrush in hand, working diligently on the patio doors. The afternoon air was filled with the soft strains of music drifting from inside the house, mixing with distant sounds from the park. She was focused, absorbed in her work, and seemingly safe in the care of the household. Her foster mother, Lois Jenkins, had earlier encouraged her to spend time in the garden after a minor argument over a pair of trainers Billie-Jo wanted but could not have. Lois, aiming to redirect her foster daughter's energy, had suggested painting as a constructive alternative, a task that allowed Billie-Jo to express herself creatively while remaining occupied and engaged. At the same time, Lois had taken some of the other children, Maya and Esther, for a walk with the dog. Charlotte, another daughter, was away at her clarinet lesson, leaving Billie-Jo and Annie behind. Her foster father, Sion Jenkins, had left briefly to collect Charlotte and her friend from their music lesson. In that moment, everything appeared normal. The routine, ordinary flow of life in the Jenkins household masked the extraordinary danger that was about to unfold. Earlier in the week, There had been minor tension between Lois and Billie-Jo, but nothing to suggest the impending tragedy. Still, there were subtle warning signs. Weeks before, Cyan had noticed a strange man loitering outside the property, staring from Alexandra Park. On another occasion, he found a man in the back garden, prompting the family to install security lights and window locks. Billie-Jo herself had expressed fear of being followed, describing a man in his 40s or 50s who had been observing her since December. These incidents, while alarming, had not prevented her from continuing her normal routines. The house itself, bordered by an abandoned, boarded-up property, created potential vulnerabilities that would later become focal points in the investigation. As the afternoon progressed, Sean and the children returned from their errands. Charlotte ran upstairs to put her clarinet away, and Cyan suggested they go back out to the store. On the way, he realized he had forgotten his wallet and returned home. Around 3:30 p.m., Charlotte entered the house and was confronted with a scene that would haunt her for life. Billie-Jo lay on the ground, face turned to the side, surrounded by blood, with the paintbrush still in her hand. The brutality of the attack was immediate and shocking. Cyan reacted swiftly, shielding his daughters from the scene and calling for help. Emergency services soon arrived, filling Lower Park Road with paramedics, police officers, and investigators. The chaos of the scene contrasted sharply with the previously calm afternoon. A police surgeon, later reflecting on the case, described it as one of the most savage attacks he had ever witnessed. The method of attack, a blunt instrument taken from the garden shed, an iron tent peg, indicated premeditation, accessibility, and sudden violence. The attack had occurred in broad daylight during a window of less than 40 minutes, with no sign of forced entry, theft, or sexual assault. Investigators immediately began piecing together the timeline. The window in which Billie-Jo had been left alone was small. Cyan's movements to collect Charlotte and visit the store aligned with the estimated timing of the attack. Forensic examination later revealed that Billie-Jo had been struck repeatedly, with her skull bearing at least 5 severe impacts. The tent peg, left out earlier in the garden by one of the children, became the weapon that ended her life. The investigation was complicated by the fact that the crime had occurred so quickly and in a domestic space, leaving minimal opportunity for external witnesses to intervene. The family's prior awareness of unusual activity, such as the stranger observed in the park, became a central point of the investigation. Cyan's earlier encounters with suspicious individuals, combined with anonymous phone calls Billie-Jo had received in the past, introduced the possibility of an external perpetrator. Billie-Jo had voiced concerns about being watched, not only in December 1996, but also in previous years, suggesting that her fears were long-standing and justified. The investigative team considered whether someone could have been hiding nearby, using the abandoned property as a vantage point or a hiding place to strike at the precise moment when Billie-Jo was alone in the garden. Police collected evidence meticulously. Blood spatter patterns, the placement of the body, and the location of the weapon were all documented. Forensic experts analyzed the scene for fingerprints, footprints, and other trace evidence. The distribution of blood and the nature of the wounds indicated a sudden and deliberate attack rather than an accidental injury. Investigators sought to reconstruct both the perpetrator's actions and the timeline of events leading up to the murder. Attention soon turned toward the household itself. Billie-Jo Jenkins, despite his public persona as a respected educator, came under scrutiny. His demeanor, movements, and presence during the critical period were carefully examined. Investigators considered whether his account of running errands, returning home, and interacting with his children aligned with the forensic evidence and timelines established by the crime scene. Every detail was scrutinized, from the timing of leaving the house to the interactions between the children and the adults. During initial interviews, neighbors corroborated the Jenkins family's descriptions of the day, but they also provided additional context. People had observed unusual activity in the vicinity in the months prior, including the figure Billie-Jo had described. Friends confirmed that Billie-Jo had mentioned being followed, reinforcing the notion that she had perceived genuine threats. However, no direct witness to the attack could be found, leaving the investigative team to rely on circumstantial and forensic evidence to determine the sequence of events. The immediate aftermath of the murder saw an outpouring of grief and confusion. Lois, who had been unaware of the attack while she was out walking with the dog, returned to find emergency services at the scene. She was informed of the tragic loss of Billie-Jo, a foster daughter who had been part of the family for 5 years. The shock of discovering the brutality of the crime, combined with her role as a parent and caregiver, added an emotional weight to the investigation that was palpable to officers and onlookers. The initial forensic findings, combined with the family's statements, painted a complex picture. Billie-Jo had been attacked from behind, using the tent peg to deliver blows with extraordinary force. No signs of sexual assault were found, eliminating certain investigative avenues, while the absence of forced entry suggested the perpetrator was either known to the household or had ready access to the garden. Police considered multiple possibilities: an external intruder, someone exploiting prior vulnerabilities, or an individual within the household. Weeks following the murder, attention turned to known individuals with potential connections to the family. Local men had been seen in the vicinity, including a man known as Mr. B, described as fair, haired with a facial mark, whose erratic behavior had raised concerns. Although he was initially a suspect due to proximity and previous suspicious conduct, forensic evidence and witness testimony eventually ruled him out. The focus shifted increasingly inward, toward those with access, knowledge of the household, and proximity at the time of the crime. Sian Jenkins, the foster father, came under particularly intense scrutiny. While he had consistently maintained his innocence, his prior claims regarding his professional accomplishments, demeanor during the initial investigation, and role in the household were examined in detail. Investigators explored both motive and opportunity, analyzing the consistency of his account with forensic timelines, blood patterns, and witness observations. The combination of these factors made him a central figure in the unfolding legal investigation. The investigation also examined the broader household dynamics. Billie-Jo's previous reports of being followed, her observations of unusual men in the park, and the family's prior responses to these concerns were reviewed in the context of potential external threats. Investigators sought to reconcile these reports with the timing and mechanics of the murder. They assessed whether any external individual could have exploited these fears to commit the attack, or whether the circumstances suggested a more internal, familial involvement. By the end of the initial investigative phase, police had gathered a significant body of evidence, including forensic documentation, witness statements, and household accounts. The timing of the murder, the method of attack, the location of the body, and the physical characteristics of the crime scene all provided crucial data points. These findings laid the foundation for the eventual arrest, trial, and retrial of Sian Jenkins, while simultaneously raising profound questions about the reliability of eyewitness accounts, household testimony, and the interpretation of forensic evidence. The Jenkins case immediately captured public attention. Local residents, still processing the trauma of the brutal murder, debated the possibility of external versus internal culpability. Media coverage amplified both the tragedy and the emerging controversy surrounding the investigation, highlighting not only the crime itself, but the challenges of constructing a coherent narrative from complex forensic and testimonial evidence. Trials, appeals, and aftermath following the shocking murder of 13-year-old Billie-Jo Jenkins on February 15, 1997, Hastings was gripped by disbelief, grief, and a profound sense of unease. The brutality of the attack, coupled with the location in a familiar and seemingly safe household garden, made the case both perplexing and highly publicized. Within weeks, suspicion turned toward the household itself, focusing particularly on Sian Jenkins, Billie-Jo's foster father. The combination of proximity, opportunity, and complex family dynamics placed him at the center of one of Britain's most controversial legal proceedings. The investigation initially relied heavily on forensic evidence, eyewitness statements, and detailed reconstruction of the timeline. Forensic specialists examined the blood spatter patterns, the placement of the tent peg, and the injuries sustained by Billie-Jo. The repeated blows to her skull indicated a sudden eruption of force and rage, and investigators sought to determine whether the attack could have been inflicted by someone unfamiliar with the household or by someone with intimate access. These analyses pointed to a narrow window of opportunity, coinciding with Sion's departure to collect other children and the brief absence from the property, which investigators argued provided him with both access and time to commit the crime. In March 1997, just weeks after the murder, Sion Jenkins was formally charged with the murder of Billie-Jo. The charges shocked Hastings, not only because of the heinous nature of the crime, but also because Sion had long been seen as a respectable educator and community member. His academic and professional credentials, which he had presented as impressive, were later found to be exaggerated. Sion claimed to have studied at prestigious institutions, including Gordonstown, achieved top exam results, and obtained degrees from the University of Kent along with postgraduate qualifications. Under scrutiny, these claims collapsed. His academic record was less distinguished, showing average exam results and no trace of the postulated prestigious degrees. Investigators argued that Sion had crafted a meticulous facade, presenting an image of accomplishment and reliability that sharply contrasted with the violent crime under investigation. The initial trial unfolded at the Old Bailey and attracted national attention. The prosecution built its case around the evidence gathered from the crime scene, including the method and timing of the attack, the positioning of Billie-Jo's body, and Sion's movements during the critical period. They argued that the assault had been carried out in a sudden eruption of rage and deliberate violence. The tent peg, taken from the garden shed, had been within his reach, and forensic evidence suggested the blows were consistent with someone present in the garden and familiar with its layout. The prosecution framed Sion as a man capable of premeditated violence, suggesting that the attack was not a random act of aggression, but a deliberate assault that took place in broad daylight, during a window when he was responsible for the children. Defense attorneys, however, countered with an alternative narrative. They highlighted Billie-Jo's prior reports of being stalked and followed, both inside and outside the home. Witnesses recalled sightings of an unidentified man loitering in Alexandra Park, consistent with Billie-Jo's own descriptions. The defense suggested that the crime could have been committed by an external individual, exploiting the brief absence of adults from the household. They argued that forensic evidence, including the blood spray on Sion's clothing, could be explained by him bending down to assist Billie-Jo after she had already been injured, rather than by direct contact during the assault. This interpretation introduced reasonable doubt, challenging the prosecution's claim that Sion had intentionally killed his foster daughter. The household dynamics further complicated the case. Sion and Lois Jenkins had fostered several children over the years, creating a complex environment where discipline, arguments, and disagreements were part of daily life. Witness testimony revealed occasional use of corporal punishment, incidents of siblings being physically disciplined, and disputes among children. The prosecution argued that these factors painted a picture of a man prone to sudden bursts of anger, while the defense maintained that such instances were consistent with the disciplinary norms of a household and did not provide evidence of homicidal intent. Central to the case were the statements of the Jenkins children. Initially, some had supported Sion's account, suggesting that he could not have committed the crime during the short window of time he was away. However, later reports indicated that the children had altered their statements, no longer fully backing his narrative. The defense, concerned about the reliability of these accounts, decided not to call the children as witnesses during the trial. This decision was significant, as it left the jury with a limited perspective on key aspects of the household timeline and Sion's interactions with the children during the critical moments. The trial lasted 19 days, with 15 witnesses called, ranging from forensic experts to psychiatrists. Expert testimony focused on the nature and severity of Billie-Jo's injuries, reconstructing the sequence of the assault, and providing insights into the physical mechanics of the attack. Psychiatrists offered evaluations of Sion Jenkins' personality and behavioral tendencies, examining traits such as temper, stress response, and potential for aggression, while the defense emphasized potential flaws in the forensic analysis and the possibility of an external perpetrator. The prosecution's presentation underscored the consistency of evidence pointing to Sion. After 2 days of jury deliberation, the verdict was delivered, Sion Jenkins was found guilty of the murder of Billie-Jo. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge describing the crime as horrendous and characterizing him as a serious danger to society. The public reaction in Hastings was polarized. Many residents believed justice had been served, while others questioned the certainty of the evidence and whether reasonable doubt had been fully addressed. The case left an indelible mark on the community, particularly for Lois Jenkins and her children, who were forced to navigate the aftermath of a crime committed within their household. In the years following the conviction, Sion Jenkins pursued appeals,